In 2013, in Cyprus, people woke up to find a financial nightmare had begun right in their accounts. They hadn't lost their jobs overnight. They hadn't invested in a scam. They hadn't gambled with the market. They had simply done what the system had advised them to do their whole lives: deposit money in the bank, trust the law, trust the security of the modern financial order. Then, with just one announcement, everything reversed. Banks closed. ATMs limited withdrawals. Transactions were blocked. The money remained there, intact on the screen. But what disappeared wasn't the numbers. What disappeared was the right to access that money. Thousands of people stood outside banks as if standing in front of their own safes, but couldn't open them. Small businesses couldn't pay salaries. Families couldn't afford their children's school fees. Those who once believed they held their assets in the safest place suddenly realized they never truly controlled them. That was the moment the world saw a chilling truth. In peacetime, assets are in your name. In times of systemic stress, those assets may be prioritized for a different purpose. Not you. But the bank. But liquidity. But the very survival of the financial machine. And this is the most terrifying part. Cyprus is not the only story. It's just a moment where the veneer of security was peeled away too quickly, too clearly, too brutally for the world to continue pretending not to see. From Argentina to Lebanon, from capital controls to banking crises, history has repeatedly conveyed the same message: what people call their assets is only truly theirs as long as the system allows it. And right there, a silent line emerges. On one side are assets entirely within the system's control, capable of being monitored, restricted, frozen, taxed, or even redefined by a single policy decision. On the other side are assets that are harder for the system to reach. Harder to lock down. Harder to neutralize. Harder to pull into a bailout. These aren't always the most glamorous assets. They aren't always the fastest growing assets. But in times when trust begins to crumble, these are precisely the places where smart money quietly finds its way. Because ultimately, whether an asset remains yours isn't just about its value. It's about a far more brutal question. Is it in your hands, or in the hands of the system? And from here, the list of 8 assets outside the system of control is no longer a topic of curiosity. It becomes a financial survival map. A map showing that when the rules of the game begin to change, what things can still retain real ownership, and what things are only safe until the moment of crisis knocks on the door. The first asset on this list is also the most familiar to the history of human currency, yet often the most overlooked in an era where people believe that all value can be digitized, stored, and protected by a line of code in the banking system. It is this underestimation that has led many to only realize its true role when the door to withdraw money has closed. For years, the public has been taught to believe a very plausible story. That as long as your assets are legal, clearly documented, held by a large organization, protected by law, and operating in an orderly country, they are almost certainly safe. On the surface, that argument seems sound. Banks have deposit insurance. Securities firms have custody systems. Real estate has title deeds. Financial platforms have identity verification, control processes, legal frameworks, and supervisory bodies. All of that makes people feel secure. And that very sense of security creates a powerful illusion. As long as the assets are still in the system, as long as your name is on the records, as long as everything is legal, you still hold real ownership. But financial history has never been that simple. Because, under normal circumstances, what people call ownership is usually understood in a legal sense. Your name is on the contract. Your name is in the account. Your name appears in the custody records. On paper, that's enough to make you believe the property is yours. But when the system is under stress, the concept of ownership begins to split into two very different parts. One side is nominal ownership. The other side is actual access. And it is at that point that many people discover they only hold the first part. A person might own money in the bank but be unable to withdraw it. An investor might own stocks but be unable to sell them when liquidity disappears. A businessman might have profits on paper but be unable to move cash out of the country. A family may hold real estate in their own name, but its value is eroded by taxes, inflation, maintenance costs, and market freezes. All of that remains legal. It still exists. It's still present in the system. But the sense of security has completely changed. That's why so many people misunderstand the nature of protection. They believe the system is designed to protect individual assets. In reality, the system is primarily designed to protect itself. When things are stable, these two goals can coexist. But when a crisis arises, the true priority quickly becomes apparent. Laws don't disappear. Regulations don't disappear. Order doesn't disappear. It's just that the entire system begins to operate with a different goal. Keeping banks from collapsing. Keeping capital from fleeing. Keeping the currency from losing confidence too quickly. Keep the market from descending into a chain reaction of panic. And when that goal becomes paramount, every asset deep within the system immediately becomes subject to delayed access, closer scrutiny, revaluation, controlled flow, or simply locked down for a period long enough that the owner is no longer able to defend themselves. That's also why common reassurances are only half true. People say money in the bank is safe. True, until you need to withdraw it while everyone else wants to do the same. People say custodial financial assets are transparent. True, until that transparency means everything is within the reach of the control mechanism. People say real estate is a real asset. Also true, but a real asset isn't necessarily a flexible asset, and certainly not an asset beyond the reach of administrative power. The biggest problem isn't that those beliefs are entirely wrong. The problem is that they confuse security during normal times with the ability to maintain control during times of instability. And those two things are never the same. When that veil of illusion falls, the question is no longer which asset is the best performing, which is the most familiar, or which is the most heavily promoted. The question becomes colder, more realistic, and far more ruthless. Of all the things humanity possesses, which is the most difficult for the system to reach when it begins to protect itself? It is from that point that the first asset on the list emerges not as an investment option, but as a historical artifact, one that has survived more monetary regimes than any modern promise has ever done. The first asset outside the system of control wasn't a new technology. Not a modern financial product. Not something that just appeared a few years ago and is being touted as the solution to every crisis. It was a very old asset. So old that it existed before central banks, before modern paper money, before the financial platforms that people trust almost absolutely today. It was physical gold. Not gold on an app. Not gold in a digital account that only shows a few numbers. Not a promise that somewhere there is a quantity of gold being held for you. But gold that you actually hold. The reason gold always returns during periods of instability isn't because it's perfect. Gold doesn't pay interest. It doesn't generate cash flow. It doesn't make its owner rich quickly. In times of market euphoria, it's even seen as slow, outdated, and unattractive. But whenever faith in currency begins to crumble, it is this seemingly outdated asset that emerges from the shadows. The reason is simple. Physical gold doesn't depend on a bank's promise to repay a debt. It doesn't depend on a government's ability to pay. It doesn't depend on whether an electronic system allows you to log in. It doesn't need a surviving intermediary to prove its value. In a world where most assets exist as recorded, deposited, authenticated, and accessible through systems, physical gold is one of the few things that retains the most fundamental characteristic of ownership. It can be held, transferred, stored, and exists without permission. That's what makes it different. Before the crisis, that difference might seem insignificant. But when the system starts to shake, it instantly becomes a huge gap. An account can be frozen. A transaction can be blocked. A platform can cease operation. A financial asset can have its trading suspended precisely when the owner needs to exit most. But with physical gold, control doesn't lie with the server. It lies in the act of holding. And that's why the financial elite always have a very special attitude towards gold. They may not talk about it every day. They may not praise it during periods of strong market rallies. But whenever systemic risk emerges, gold quietly appears in their defensive portfolio. Not because they believe gold will replace the entire modern monetary system, but because they understand a very pragmatic thing: when confidence erodes, assets without counterparty risk become more valuable than ever. The important thing here is not to idolize gold. Gold doesn't make you instantly rich. It's not a money printing machine. Nor is it immune to short-term price fluctuations. There are periods when gold remains stagnant for a long time, making holders feel like they're holding an asset that's doing nothing. But that's where many people misunderstand its true nature. Gold doesn't exist to help you win during the most euphoric years. Gold exists to help you not be swept away during the most turbulent years. In an age where people are increasingly living more deeply within the digital system, the very physicality, independence, and lack of intermediaries of gold become irreplaceable. An ounce of gold doesn't need anyone's confirmation to exist. It doesn't need a smoothly functioning system to be recognized as wealth. It doesn't need faith in an issuing organization. It simply requires the oldest belief that humankind has placed in it for thousands of years. And the closer we get to periods where paper money is eroded by inflation, public debt, bailout policies, or crises of confidence, the stronger that allure becomes. Not flashy. Not ostentatious. but enduring and formidable in the way that the longest surviving assets often are. However, physical gold is not the most versatile, nor the most difficult to control in everyday life. Because right after it is an asset even closer to the instinct for survival, something that not only retains value, but in times of chaos, can buy time, security, and the ability to continue living normally when all the surrounding structures begin to malfunction. Right after physical gold comes an asset that most people have held in their hands thousands of times, yet rarely see as a true defensive tool. That's physical cash outside the banking system. It sounds so familiar it's almost commonplace. Because in a world where electronic payments, digital wallets, instant transfers, and digital banking have become the default rhythm of life, cash is often seen as something of the past. Slow, inconvenient, outdated. For many, holding cash is even considered financially ill-informed, as it doesn't generate profit, doesn't appreciate in value, and doesn't create a sense of asset optimization. But crises never ask you which asset looks more modern. Crisis only asks one thing: what remains usable even when the system starts to clump up. And in that moment, physical cash instantly changes roles. It's no longer just a conventional means of payment. It becomes time, it becomes proactiveness, it becomes the first buffer between a person and the panic spreading through the financial system. When banks limit withdrawals, cash becomes precious. When ATMs run out of money, cash becomes precious. When electronic payment networks malfunction, cash becomes precious. When crowds begin frantically searching for liquidity, cash is no longer just printed paper. It becomes the right to continue living normally for a few more days, weeks, sometimes months. That's something many people only realize when the crisis has already occurred. In normal times, people believe that the balance in their account and the money in their wallet are almost one and the same. With just a few taps on their phone, they can spend, transfer, pay, and withdraw at any time. The convenience is so smooth that people forget a simple truth: money in the bank is money you have access to, while cash in hand is money you have direct control. The difference between the two is usually small on calm days. But on stressful days, it can be a chasm. A person with $100,000 in an account who can't withdraw it may be at a significant disadvantage in the short term compared to someone with only a few $1,000s in cash. Not because the latter is richer, but because at that moment, he has a more important asset: the ability to act immediately. That's what makes cash such a special defensive asset. It doesn't make you rich. It doesn't protect you from long-term inflation. It's not the optimal store of value for decades. But it is one of the very few assets that can keep your life from falling apart in the first days of a systemic shock. Therefore, physical cash should not be viewed as an investment. It should be viewed as a financial survival buffer. A buffer that allows you to buy food when the payment system is disrupted. Allows you to travel when your cards are not working. Allows you to handle urgent needs without waiting for an institution to unlock your assets. And interestingly, the more modern societies become, heavily reliant on digital payments and electronic banking, the more underestimated the role of cash in unforeseen circumstances. The smoothness of the system makes people forget that every system, no matter how modern, has its breaking points. Just one liquidity shock, a capital control order, a banking crisis, a widespread technical failure, or simply a wave of panic cash withdrawals, and the entire feeling of always being accessible can disappear faster than anyone realizes. Cash won't save a collapsing system, but it can save individuals from being swallowed up at the same speed as that system. That's why people who truly understand risk never put their entire payment capacity on a phone screen. They understand that in the digital age, absolute reliance on electronic financial infrastructure is also a form of vulnerability. And sometimes, the most rudimentary asset is the one that holds the most freedom in the initial moments of chaos. But cash still has a fatal flaw. It helps you survive in the short term, but it doesn't protect your purchasing power in the long term. It gives you the upper hand for a few days, a few weeks, but if the crisis drags on and the currency starts to depreciate rapidly, this very cushion will wear away day by day in your hands. And that's when the next asset comes along, something that's not only outside the system of physical control, but also directly linked to the most basic human needs: eating, living, and surviving. When money can lose value, when markets can freeze, when financial promises can be delayed, that asset still retains its power because it touches on a need that no crisis can erase. The next asset doesn't shine like gold. It doesn't give the feeling of wealth like real estate. Nor does it make its owner look like a sophisticated investor. But in any truly turbulent time, it's the most powerful thing in a very primal way. It's essential goods that are directly under your control. Food, clean water, fuel, basic medicine. The minimum necessities to sustain life for days, even weeks, without immediately depending on the normal functioning of the market. In stable conditions, very few people view these as assets. They view them as consumer goods. Petty reserves. Something you can have or not have, because you can just walk to the supermarket, open the app, swipe your card, order, and a few hours later everything will be at your doorstep. But all that convenience is only true as long as the distribution system is running, the supply chain is functioning, money is flowing, and the crowds haven't panicked. Once one of those links breaks, the true value of essential goods immediately becomes apparent. Because in a crisis, something changes very quickly that many people don't realize in time. That is the gap between having money and being able to buy goods. You may have money in your account, but the supermarket shelves are empty. You may still have credit, but gasoline is no longer readily available. You may still have paper assets, but medicine is becoming scarce. You may still have a beautiful investment portfolio, but exchanging it for what is most needed at that moment is not simple at all. At that point, the power of assets no longer lies in their financial value. It reverts to the most fundamental nature of all economies, meeting basic survival needs. A family with enough food, water, medicine, and essential supplies for several weeks not only feels safer, they are actually in a stronger position. They are not forced to rush into the scrambling crowds. They don't have to buy everything at panic prices. They are not forced to make bad decisions simply because they are short of time. In a crisis, the first thing that erodes is often not money, but calmness. And any asset that helps people prolong their calm for a few days, a few weeks, is worth far more than its humble appearance suggests. That is why essential goods are outside the system of control in a very deep sense. They don't need bank confirmation. They don't need an unlocking platform. They don't need a market that prices every second. They don't need an intermediary organization that is still functioning to be effective. When it's in your home, in your warehouse, under your direct control, its value no longer depends on the smooth functioning of the system. It depends on something even more enduring than the market, the human need for survival. This is also why, in every period of turmoil from war, lockdowns, high inflation, major natural disasters to logistical disruptions, the most seemingly ordinary things become the hard assets of life. Not because they are inherently scarce, but because when the order of distribution is distorted, availability immediately becomes value. Many people only view assets through the lens of price appreciation. But in times of instability, there is another lens that is even more important, the ability to keep life from falling into a state of passivity. Gold preserves value. Cash maintains short-term liquidity. And essential goods prevent you from being forced to beg the system in the early days of chaos. It's a kind of freedom rarely mentioned in financial conversations. Because it's not glamorous. It doesn't build a get-rich-quick scheme. But it builds something far more fundamental, the ability to stand firm when the rest starts to falter. However strong this asset class is, it has its limits. You can't stockpile it for your entire life. You can't carry an entire warehouse of essential goods to preserve your wealth for years. It protects you well during the initial shock, but it's not a long-term bridge to weather a prolonged period of upheaval. And that's where the next asset comes in, something that's not only tied to basic survival needs, but also capable of retaining value over time because it's the foundation for creating food, producing goods, and accessing something every society needs, even when currencies change, banks shake, or financial markets go astray. The next asset class isn't found in an app. It doesn't display flashing numbers on a screen. It doesn't fluctuate by the second to stimulate emotions like the financial market. It's slower, heavier, less flashy. But precisely because of that, during prolonged periods of instability, it becomes one of the most irreplaceable asset classes. That's agricultural land and land capable of generating essential needs. Not all land is the same. A speculative plot caught in a price surge and a plot that can be used for farming, livestock raising, water extraction, or generating actual output are two completely different stories. When the system runs smoothly, the market often rewards speculative assets with expectations of price increases and crowd hype. But when instability persists, what matters is no longer how much the price has risen, but whether the asset actually generates real value. And land, with its ability to generate essential needs, is one such form of real value. It's not just a store of wealth. It can be a source of food. A source of independent cash flow. A source of self-reliance in a world where supply chains, prices, and access to goods can fluctuate more wildly than people imagine. That's what sets this type of asset apart from many assets deeply embedded in the financial system. A stock may represent ownership of a business, but you still need a functioning market to convert that ownership into cash. A deposit may be liquid in peacetime, but you still need banks open and a system accessible. A financial asset may be highly valued, but that value still passes through many intermediaries. As for land with the potential to generate real output, a portion of its value persists even when market sentiment shifts. People can postpone buying cars, houses, or luxury goods. But they cannot postpone the basic needs of food, drink, and survival. Therefore, during periods of prolonged inflation, currency instability, supply chain crises, or a breakdown in confidence in paper assets, agricultural land is often viewed in a very different light. It's not just an asset. It's productive capacity. And once you own an asset linked to productive capacity, you're no longer entirely dependent on the distribution system. You begin to shift towards being able to create what the market always needs. That's an extremely important change. Because during a prolonged crisis, what depletes people isn't just the loss of money. What depletes them is the feeling that their entire livelihood depends on increasingly unstable structures. Prices are soaring. Supply is erratic. The cost of living is volatile. Jobs are uncertain. In this context, any asset that can generate real output becomes a very strong anchor. Of course, land is not magic. It lacks flexibility. It's difficult to subdivide. It's difficult to move. It's susceptible to legal risks, taxes, planning, natural disasters, and management quality. But that's no reason to underestimate it. On the contrary, it's precisely its close connection to the real world that gives it a weight that many financial assets lack. While many other assets merely reflect belief, land's ability to generate output reflects something deeper, the ability to continue to exist and create value regardless of currency fluctuations or market sentiment. The wealthy understand this very well. They can speculate in the market when the cycle is favorable. They can hold financial assets to capitalize on growth momentum. But at a deeper level, much of the large flow of money ultimately returns to things that are tangible, controllable, and create real demand. Not because that's the most compelling story, but because when the financial veneer starts to peel away, the world ultimately returns to what serves real life. And that's where land becomes frightening in a very quiet way. It doesn't need to be promoted every day. It doesn't need to increase in value every week to prove its value. It just needs to stand there, produce output, maintain access to essential needs, and wait until the financial system begins to remind people that not all wealth should be measured by the speed of transactions. But no matter how valuable land is, it remains a heavy, slow, and difficult asset to move. It's suitable for those who want to anchor a portion of their wealth in the real world for the long term, rather than being the most flexible option when risks suddenly arise or when people are forced to relocate quickly. And that's why the next asset on the list goes in the complete opposite direction. Not as heavy as land. Not as fixed as houses. But precisely because of its compactness, privacy, and direct transferability, it's one of the most inconspicuous asset classes that the system finds difficult to fully detect, and even harder to access when changes first begin. The next asset class is almost never mentioned publicly when discussing wealth security. It's not at the heart of financial presentations. It's not promoted by banks. It doesn't appear in modern investment campaigns. And precisely because it's so quiet, so private, so difficult to standardize, it becomes a very special asset class during periods of instability. These are high-value items that are easy to store, easy to move, and can be directly transferred outside the system. Gold jewelry. High-quality gemstones. High-value mechanical watches. Some genuine collectibles with liquidity within specialized circles. Not all expensive items fall into this category. The vast majority of luxury goods are simply liabilities disguised as assets. But there is a very small class of assets that possess four characteristics that the modern financial system dislikes: compact, private, high value in a small size, and the ability to change hands without passing through a centralized control gate. It is these four characteristics that make this type of asset noteworthy. In peacetime, they are often seen as jewelry, status accessories, or hobbies of the wealthy. But in times of turmoil, their meaning changes drastically. A gold ring, a set of valuable jewelry, a gemstone recognized by the international market, or a watch tradable through reputable trading networks, sometimes ceases to be mere consumer symbols. They become compressed value, wealth compressed into a compact, discrete form that can be carried, stored, exchanged, and preserved through situations where large, bulky, or system-driven assets cannot. That is the point many people underestimate. When instability strikes, not everyone has the time to sit and wait for the market to open. Not everyone can sell real estate in a few days. Not everyone can transfer a large sum of money through a bank at the exact moment they need it. But a small, compact item of value can give its owner a kind of flexibility that few other assets offer, the ability to move wealth with them. In times of tight capital controls, scrutinized cash flow, or when people begin to worry about whether assets deeply embedded in the system truly belong to them anymore, the value of compactness instantly skyrockets. A piece of land cannot be hidden. An apartment cannot be moved. A bank account cannot be separated from the system that holds it. But a high-value item, if chosen correctly, can accompany its owner through times when speed and discretion are vital. This isn't romanticism. This is the very real logic of crisis. History has repeatedly shown that, during periods when people are forced to leave their homes, relocate, protect the core of their family assets, or simply need to keep a portion of their wealth out of the immediate reach of the control apparatus, those that are compact and have a concentrated value always play their own role. They are not flashy, not official, but real. Of course, this is not an easy asset class to play. It requires knowledge. It requires the ability to distinguish between true value and inflated luxury goods. It requires an understanding of actual liquidity, not the flashy listed price in advertisements. And most importantly, it requires the owner to accept an unpleasant truth: the market for this asset class is not for the naive. If you buy incorrectly, you are holding an expensive item that is difficult to sell. If you misunderstand, you are holding a symbol of consumption, not a layer of asset defense. If you're too blind to appearances, you might mistake social value for survival value. But if chosen correctly, this type of asset can play a very special role in the structure of wealth defense. It doesn't replace gold. It doesn't replace cash. It doesn't replace land. But it complements something the other three groups don't have fully at the same time: privacy, mobility, and the ability to compress value into a very small space. That's why families who truly understand risk rarely put all their wealth into a single form. They know that crises don't come in a fixed scenario. Sometimes it's inflation. Sometimes it's liquidity crunch. Sometimes it's capital controls. Sometimes it's supply chain disruptions. And sometimes, what's most needed isn't to increase profits, but to keep a portion of value that can accompany them through the turmoil. However, no matter how flexible it is, this asset class still has a clear limitation. It's good at storing and moving value, but it doesn't generate cash flow. It helps you preserve wealth, but it doesn't help you rebuild your life if the upheaval lasts longer than expected. And that's where the next asset comes in. Not as glittering as gold. Not as compact as gemstones. Not as stable as land. But in a world where control is increasingly scrutinizing accounts, contracts, and transaction flows, this creates a form of power that the system is far harder to seize: the ability to generate income through one's own skills, networks, and direct communication abilities. And then we come across an asset class that many people never consider an asset until a real crisis hits. Because it's not in a safe. Not in a bank. No stock ticker. No land title. Not immediately visible like gold, land, or stored goods. But when all financial structures begin to shake, this is what helps some people stay afloat, still make money, still maintain control, even when others are trapped in an increasingly restrictive system. It's the skill of generating income outside of a centrally controlled system. A skilled craftsman can repair, build, install, and get paid directly. A person with basic medical skills, caregiving, therapy, cooking, machine repair, farming, transportation, teaching, maintenance, programming, design, translation, or any other skill that others truly need, possesses a very special type of asset. A person with their own client network, personal reputation, and the ability to exchange value directly without relying entirely on a centralized payroll system also possesses such a class of asset. What makes this type of asset special is that it doesn't just help you preserve value. It helps you create new value in the midst of uncertainty. That's the huge difference. Gold preserves wealth. Cash preserves short-term liquidity. Land generates output. High-value items help move assets. But the skills and capacity for direct exchange do something quite different. They allow people not only to defend themselves, but also to continue operating their lives while the turmoil continues. And in prolonged periods of chaos, that is a strength that no passive asset can completely replace. Because ultimately, what destroys a person is not just the loss of assets. What destroys them is the loss of the ability to generate new income in a world where old doors are closing one by one. A person who relies solely on a fixed salary from a system that is cutting staff will be very vulnerable. A person who relies solely on paper assets will easily panic when those assets become illiquid. But a person with skills truly needed by the market, who can exchange directly, who can work in many different environments, locations, and forms, possesses a kind of freedom that is very difficult to lock down. Not because they are immune to crises. Because what they own isn't entirely in an account that can be frozen, not entirely in a market that can cease trading, and doesn't exist solely through faith in an intermediary. It lies within themselves. That's why, In every period of major disruption, from deep recessions, high inflation, banking crises to periods of dramatic labor market reversals, the best survivors aren't always the ones who were once the richest on paper. Very often, it's the one who retains the ability to be paid for tangible value. This is something the system is very difficult to fully control. It can tax official income. It can track large transactions. It can centrally monitor businesses. But it's not easy to completely neutralize an individual who creates value through their skills, knowledge, reputation, personal network, and ability to serve the real needs of others. A person might lose their job at a company but still retain their skills. They might lose old clients but still retain their reputation. They might lose one source of income but still have the ability to generate another. It's no longer just a job. It's a layer of movable, intangible, yet incredibly durable assets. And it's noteworthy that this type of asset is becoming increasingly important in the modern world, where many people have become accustomed to confusing income with the ability to generate income. Income is what you receive in the present. The ability to generate income is the machine behind it. When times are stable, these two things often go together, so few people pay attention. But when the cycle reverses, businesses shrink, credit tightens, the cost of living rises, and the layoff machine begins to operate, most people suddenly realize they only possess temporary cash flow, not the actual money-making machine. Conversely, those who retain that engine within themselves still have a fallback option. This is also why families that survive well through turbulent times often accumulate not only tangible assets, but also quietly accumulate skills, relationships, personal reputation, sales skills, repair skills, adaptability, and the ability to switch from one form of income-generating activity to another without being completely paralyzed when circumstances change. That's something very difficult to measure with a balance sheet. But in a crisis, it can be worth more than a portfolio stuck on a screen. However, no matter how strong you are, your skills and ability to generate income still depend on your health, time, personal flexibility, and the ability of the market around you to function at some level. It's an extremely powerful asset for regenerating cash flow, but it's not the ultimate asset that makes the system most difficult to access. Because what follows is an asset even deeper than money, gold, and skill. Something almost intangible, yet whenever the times begin to enter a period of instability, it determines who gets access to opportunities, who gets protection first, who manages to survive, and who is left behind as the doors of the system gradually close. Would you like me to continue to the next part? The next type of asset is almost never seen on any bank statement. You can't open your banking app to see if it's going up or down. There are no price charts, no transaction codes, no authority confirming daily that you own it. But in every major systemic breakdown, this is what silently creates the gap between those who have a way out and those who are trapped. It's the network of relationships outside the formal system, which holds real value and a high degree of trust. At first glance, many might think this is just a social factor, not an asset. But crises always have a cruel way of forcing people to reconsider the definition of wealth. Because at a certain point, an asset is no longer just something you own. It's also something you can access through others. A phone call can help you find a source of goods when the market starts to become scarce. A trustworthy relationship can help you transition to a new job faster when businesses cut back. A close-knit community can give you information sooner, opportunities sooner, and a way out sooner. A trustworthy acquaintance can open up cash flow, support, a safety net, clients, housing, partners, or simply a door that money can't buy during times of chaos. That's why, during periods of systemic stress, some people may not appear wealthier than others, but they don't fall like the majority. Not because they have a magical secret, but because behind them lies an invisible asset that others don't see. That is social trust accumulated before the crisis occurred. And that trust is incredibly valuable precisely when all institutional promises begin to weaken. When banks are stable, people trust contracts. When the market is favorable, people trust procedures. When the economy is growing, people trust the system of distributing opportunities. But when a crisis strikes, the world begins to operate on a different logic. People turn to acquaintances first. They trust those who have proven their credibility first. They give opportunities to those who have built trust first. They reserve positions for those with sufficiently deep connections first. At that point, the network of relationships is no longer an auxiliary factor. It becomes a vital infrastructure. A businessman may lose a large contract, but if he still has a network of loyal customers, he won't collapse. A worker may lose their old job, but if they still have a strong professional network, they still have a path to a new job. A family may experience a liquidity shock, but if they still have a close-knit community to support them, that shock may not necessarily turn into a disaster. That's what makes this type of asset so uniquely uncontrollable. The system can control accounts. It can monitor transactions. It can tighten procedures. It can freeze capital flows. But it's very difficult to completely freeze human trust. It's very difficult to confiscate a network built on genuine credibility. It's very difficult to completely neutralize a community whose members are willing to support each other when the system becomes colder. It's very difficult to replace the value of someone who has proven themselves trustworthy over many years. This is also why, during turbulent periods in history, many families didn't survive on their greatest asset, but on their most valuable relationships. An acquaintance helps make the right decisions at the right time. A partner helps manage cash flow. A loyal customer helps keep a job alive. A community helps share resources when the external market becomes more hostile. All of that doesn't sound like the modern definition of wealth. But that's only because the world has been stable for so long that people are used to seeing wealth in numbers. When the system shakes, they understand a very old truth: sometimes the most valuable assets aren't in the safe, but in the doors that remain open for you when most others are closing. Of course, not all relationships are created equal. Social connections aren't assets. A long contact list isn't an asset. Surface-level greetings aren't assets. Only relationships built on trust, genuine exchange value, and mutual support carry weight in a crisis. And that's something you can't buy overnight. It has to be built up while things are still normal, before you actually need it. Therefore, this type of asset is both powerful and ruthless. It rewards those who invested in reputation, kindness, competence, and connections long before. But it's almost useless for those who only start seeking connections right when a crisis has already struck. And that's where this list reaches the final layer of assets. Not the brightest, not the most visible, but it's the layer of assets without which everything above can be misused, misaccumulated, or lost at the most crucial moment. Ultimately, what determines whether you keep your assets isn't just what you own. It's also how deeply you understand this game. Would you like me to continue to the final part? And then, the final layer of assets emerges. It can't be stored in a safe. It can't be transferred. It can't be bought impulsively in a panic. It can't be borrowed from others when a crisis has already begun. But without it, gold can be bought at the wrong time. Cash can be mishandled. Land can become a burden. Skills can be wasted. Relationships can be misplaced. And everything you call assets can vanish with a single wrong decision during a moment of emotional collapse. That is independent financial knowledge and the ability to see the true nature of the system. On the surface, it doesn't sound like an asset. But precisely because people often don't see it as an asset, they only realize its value after paying a very high price. During times of rising prices, many people think they're smart. When credit is easy, they think it's an opportunity. When assets swell on paper, they think they're getting rich. When the system runs smoothly, they think the rules of the game will last forever. But crises always begin at a very uncomfortable point, the moment reality no longer resembles the story the majority believed. And at that moment, those with assets are not necessarily the strongest. The strongest are usually those who understand what's happening sooner. Those who realize interest rates are not just a technical number, but the price of time and the pressure weighing on the entire system. Those who realize inflation not only makes things more expensive, but is silently redistributing wealth from those holding money to those holding scarce assets. Those who realize banks are not neutral safes of store, but a link in the machine of leverage and trust. Those who realize that when the state begins to need to rescue the system, the rules of the game for individuals can be rewritten very quickly. That's the true value of independent financial literacy. It doesn't help you predict every fluctuation. It doesn't turn you into a prophet. It doesn't guarantee that you'll never be wrong. But it gives you something more valuable than certainty in a crisis, the ability to avoid drowning with the crowd simply because you believe in familiar illusions. Many people lose their assets not because they are poor, nor because they are lazy. They lose because they view the world through concepts designed for normal times, while the system has moved into a different state. They still believe the money in their account is always their money. They still believe that assets that keep appreciating are safe. They still believe the majority cannot be wrong. They still believe what was true for the past 10 years will continue to be true for the next 10 years. And it is these beliefs that lead them into crisis with the most confused mindset. They have assets, but don't understand where they stand in the game of monetary power. Conversely, someone who understands the nature of the system may not get richer immediately. But they know when to maintain liquidity. When to leave the collective euphoria. When to move some assets out of control. When to prioritize survival over profit. And most importantly, they know that the number one goal during turbulent times is not to win big, but to avoid being left out of the game. That's why independent financial knowledge is the ultimate asset, but also the overarching one. Because ultimately, assets are not just what you own. Assets also include the ability to understand what is worth holding onto, what should be avoided, what only appears safe on the surface, and what truly belongs to you when the system starts to tighten its grip. And at this point, the list of 8 assets outside the system's control is no longer just a ranking. It's a warning that in an age where people are mesmerized by screens, by apps, by convenience, by the feeling that everything is already secured, we are forgetting a very old truth: the safest thing isn't necessarily the most modern, and the most modern thing isn't necessarily what will still belong to you when a real financial earthquake strikes. Because history never asks you how many numbers you have in your account. History only asks a much colder question. When the system starts to save itself, what will still be under your control? And perhaps that is the real question each person must answer for themselves, before the next crisis answers it for them.